Hello, my name is Claire Onak, and I am a new master's student working in Dr. Tim Conway's lab. And today I will be presenting the work that I did for my senior thesis at Lake Superior State University, where I was studying the environmental impacts of copper mining in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So the state of Michigan is split into two separate peninsulas, the Lower and the Upper Peninsula, that is circled here. And within the Upper Peninsula, or the UP, there is another peninsula, the Keweenaw Peninsula, that includes the region known as Copper Country that contains the area's native copper deposits. So the region has a pretty interesting geologic history. It is where the North American continent began splitting apart nearly 1 billion years ago. That stopped for some reason and instead created the Mid-Continental Rift, also known as the Keweenaw Rift, that is pictured here. And this rift system is what provided the mineral deposits that shaped the region's settlement and growth, including the copper and iron deposits. So the copper in the area is native copper, which means it's pure copper found in its metallic form, uncombined with other elements. And its formation took place through a series of steps. So first, when the crust of the earth had tried to split, the molten rock was able to rise from the earth's interior. These basaltic lava flows then poured out onto the surface and cooled, and then that left gas bubbles leaving open cavities within the lava. Subsequently, hot chemically active solutions were able to permeate into the rock, and then the constituents were rearranged into new mineral combinations. So in this map of the UP, you can see this orange stripe that cuts across the Keweenaw. That represents where the copper deposits were. And actually it'll extend underneath Lake Superior to the north there, all the way to Isle Royale, which is an island north of here where copper has also been found. And then the darker areas represent the iron deposits, which was also important to the region's economy. So the Keweenaw hosts the world's largest deposits of native copper, and it exists in 3 types of copper lodes. So first is the amygdaloid, which contains copper that formed as a mineral that filled in those empty gas bubble holes in the lava as it cooled. There's also the conglomerate lode. So that's copper that is in the material filling the spaces between pebbles of rock layers. So rivers and streams moved gravel across the region, and that was deposited onto some of those lava layers and then buried again with later lava flows. So these two forms contain small particles of copper that were scattered throughout the rock, and that accounted for over 95% of the region's copper. So these differ from the third form, which is the fissure lode, that contained masses of pure copper. So instead of it being in rock, it was just on its own, and sometimes in very large masses, and they formed when fractures cut across rock layers. So if we look at this cross-section of the Keweenaw Peninsula, this is if you're facing north. So you can see this Portage Lake lava series. This was those lava flows that I mentioned. They were one of the largest that we know of. And this included the copper deposits. So you see the conglomerate and the amygdaloid lode that sort of conform in stripes to the region's rock structure, and then the fissure lode ran across perpendicular to these. So because of these copper deposits, the region was home to a major copper mining industry. We know that thousands of years ago, the indigenous people in the Upper Peninsula had mined copper for tools and jewelry and other decorative items, but then by 1843, the US government had obtained the land of the Ojibwe people in the western UP, and that is when the mining rush began shortly after. By the 1860s, production had exceeded 14 million pounds of copper annually, and by 1925, total production reached 7.5 billion pounds. So the two forms I mentioned first, the amygdaloid and the conglomerate lodes, because they only contained 2% copper, that left the rest 98% as waste rock. So this required milling and smelting in order to separate the copper from the rock material. So mills and smelters, these facilities dotted the shorelines of lakes in the Keweenaw, both Lake Superior and some of the inland lakes. So this map shows a middle chunk of the Keweenaw Peninsula, so you can see Lake Superior on both sides. And then these darker areas represent partially the canal that runs through, connecting Lake Superior on both sides, and it connects to some of the inland lakes here, where a lot of the milling and smelting facilities were located, some of which are circled here along Portage Lake, as well as Torch Lake here in blue. So water was required in the milling process, so that is why a lot of the facilities were adjacent to a body of water. This also made it very easy for after processing for them to just dispose of the crushed waste rock, also known as tailings, directly into the lakes, along with some of the mill processing water. So Torch Lake was the site of milling and smelting facilities for more than 100 years. It acted as a repository of milling wastes, including 200 million tons of copper mill stamp sands, another term for mining waste, and this accounted for nearly half of the original volume of the lake. And this waste material is still so high in copper that afterwards they dredge them back out of the water in order to reprocess them using leaching chemicals. So if you go to Torch Lake today, you can still see this dredge that is sunken into the lake, and it was used to reclaim some of the stamp sands for further processing. So in addition to the waste material of the rocks and the leaching chemicals, these remnants of industrial facilities were all contributing to the site's contamination. So while all of this mining and polluting had taken place, there weren't really any environmental regulations in the United States. So eventually, as the copper mining industry began to decline, concern for environmental and public health impacts grew. And in the 1970s, high copper and other heavy metal concentrations were measured in and around Torch Lake. Fish abnormalities were also noticed at this time, both of which prompted investigations into some of the impacts of the mining industry. So eventually some remedial actions were taken. Several studies on the contamination in the lake in the 70s and 80s led to it being listed on the National Priorities List, or Superfund. It was also listed as a Great Lakes Area of Concern. They issued some fish consumption advisories for sauger and walleye, which are species of fish that were living in Torch Lake. So that was issued in 1983. They also used soil and vegetative cover over nearly 800 acres of mining waste around some of the lakes in the Keweenaw, and this was to cover the waste and prevent it from being transported elsewhere. And nearly 1,000 tons of soil were also removed. So along the northwestern shore of Torch Lake is the Lake Linden site, and this was the home of the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company's operations, where they processed copper ore. So they used smelting, milling, leaching, among other processes. And in this map here, I have highlighted some of the areas where some of the wastes and facilities were. So at the top, that was a large sand disposal site. Below that was a former stamp mill, and then there's also a power plant, and then at the bottom was a slag disposal area. So that was slag is one of the waste forms from smelting. So this obviously led to contamination of soil and sediments with arsenic, chromium, copper, lead, among other things. And you might have also noticed on this map they list some of the recreational areas here, because for some reason they thought it would be a good idea to build a park on this toxic waste dump of a place. But that is what they did, and that's what it is today. So in a 2014 public health assessment on the Lake Linden Village Park, the Michigan Department of Community Health stated that it was unable to determine if chemicals present in recreational areas in and around the Torch Lake Superfund site could harm people's health, because they had measured elevated levels of arsenic and lead and copper, but the measurements, they all varied spatially, and many areas hadn't really been sampled enough to make a firmer determination of the contamination. So this uncertainty is kind of what inspired the undertaking of this project in order to assess some of the potential risks to human and ecosystem health. So I traveled to Torch Lake to collect some samples to measure metals. I wanted to focus on areas that people were more likely to have direct contact with soil or water. So I chose to sample in the campground, playground, the swimming beach, as well as the boat launch, where I collected both soil and water samples, and I processed them and analyzed them using ICP-MS. And this is just a map of the site, including some of my sample sites relative to the former stamp mill. So before I present my results, I just wanted to explain how I use the NOAA screening quick reference tables for comparison. So I compared the measured environmental concentrations to these screening levels, and these are used to screen for substances that could threaten natural resources of concern to NOAA. So they vary for different animals, so birds, invertebrates, mammals, plants, and microbes all have a different level set. So for the metals measured in the soil, these are the maximum concentrations in the soil that I expressed as a percentage of the mammalian soil screening level. So this screening level, these are the SSL, these are screening numbers and not necessarily cleanup levels, so they are more conservative, and they're set. These screening ecotoxicity values are set and used to avoid underestimating the risk. So they are more conservative than some of the other levels. For example, the residential soil direct contact criteria, that is more used for human health considerations. So looking at these percentages, copper and cadmium were both over 1,000% of that mammalian screening level, and lead was over 10,000%. So these, a surrogate species was used to represent mammals in this soil screening level, and that represents the most highly exposed species. So the reasoning here is to ensure the protectiveness of all other species. So if you use the more sensitive one to set a screening level, then that would protect larger animals and those that don't have as high of an exposure as, for example, the meadow vole, which was the surrogate species in this case. So it was important to note, though, that none of the metals that were measured in this study exceeded the residential soil direct contact criteria, which is set by the EPA, and that's more for human health. Although in this study none of the levels were measured in excess of those contact criteria, other studies have. So in Ankita 2016 summarized a lot of the sampling that had been done at the site over the last 20 years or so. So on the left, these present the lead measurements. On the right is for arsenic, and the red stars indicate areas where samples were collected that exceeded the direct contact criteria. So those are set and indicate possible toxicity by accidental ingestion of the soil. So this study went as far to say that the western shoreline of Torch Lake, which is where a lot of the processing facilities were, that it cannot be safely developed due to these high levels of lead and arsenic. So now looking at the measurements in the water, I collected samples from both the boat launch and the beach, and focusing on copper and barium, which were the ones that exceeded some of those screening values. So copper levels in Torch Lake exceeded the acute screening level by 2 times, and they were 4 times greater than the chronic screening levels. Then for barium, looking at the beach sample, the concentration exceeded the chronic screening level by 10 times. And these are all in micrograms per liter or parts per billion. So looking at copper specifically in aquatic systems, it is generally present in surface waters as it is a micronutrient for plants and animals at lower concentrations, but once it gets to an elevated concentration, it can be toxic. But the naturally occurring copper in freshwater systems ranges between 0.2 and 30 micrograms per liter, and my measured value in Torch Lake of 20 micrograms per liter is within this range. So looking at copper toxicity, just because of the region's history, this is one of the main concerns in Torch Lake. So we know that fish and crustaceans are a lot more sensitive to copper than mammals are. This is because fish gills can lose the ability to regulate salt transport, and that's very important for their cardiovascular and nervous system functions. It can also affect their olfactory system, so that is their sense of smell. And looking at one study that was looking at juvenile coho salmon, so when they were exposed to 20 parts per billion copper for 30 minutes, again, this is the level that was measured in Torch Lake, the salmon experienced an 82% reduction in their olfactory response. So when we are thinking of copper toxicity, we also need to take bioavailability into consideration. So the toxicity to an aquatic organism requires the transfer of the chemical from the environment to the biochemical receptors in the organism where the toxic effects are elicited. So this transfer is not always proportional to the total concentration in the environment. For example, so in Torch Lake, the 20 parts per billion of copper that was measured, that's not necessarily the amount that will be transferred to their biochemical receptors. So just because 20 parts per billion was measured in the lake doesn't mean that the salmon will experience that 82% olfactory reduction, because if that total amount wasn't transferred to their receptors. And so this transfer depends a lot on the organism as well as the chemical and the exposure environment. And this is referring to its bioavailability, which depends a lot on the speciation or the form that it is in, because most dissolved copper tends to complex with various ligands, and not much of it is existing as free copper, which would be the more bioavailable form. So just focusing back on the human health implications of this, which was the main focus of this study, comparing the concentrations of the metals in water, I compared them to the water quality criteria that is based on the drinking water action levels. So for copper, that level is set at 1,300 micrograms per liter, and the measure of 20 micrograms per liter in Torch Lake is well below that, as well as for barium, the highest concentration measured was 42 micrograms per liter, and that's also well below 1,000 micrograms per liter that is set. So as for the results of this study, human toxicity is less of a concern for contact with soil and water in Torch Lake, and it is more of a concern for some of the smaller and aquatic organisms. So what's up with Torch Lake today? So if you were to peruse the Western Upper Peninsula Health Department's website, they have some guidance on recreating in the Keweenaw Peninsula. So for Torch Lake specifically, they advise that you do not touch any strange colored sands because they may contain high amounts of lead and other chemicals. They also advise you to stay away from the creek at all times. So if we go back to my sample map, this highlighted area is where the creek is. They acknowledge that chemicals are higher near the creek, but that they are also mostly underground by a foot or more. So they acknowledge that arsenic, lead, and copper, and PCBs, which is a persistent organic pollutant, that these are all present in the Lake Linden recreational area. However, they still say that swimming is safe, and that the biggest risk would be accidentally ingesting sand or sediment with high levels of metal. So today there are still several beneficial use impairments listed for Torch Lake. That includes the restrictions on fish consumption, but that is more for PCBs and mercury, which is unfortunately the case for a lot of Great Lakes fish. The degradation of benthos is also listed. So due to the copper that's present in the sediments, this is toxic to benthic organisms that live at the bottom of the lake. But the fish tumor use impairment was delisted in 2007 because 5 years had passed since finding any tumors. In 2019, shortly after this project was completed, the EPA did fund more restoration for the Torch Lake area of concern in order to remediate some of the contaminated sediments, especially those in the Lake Linden recreation area that were contaminated with lead, PCBs, and arsenic. So previous efforts to remediate the site haven't really provided adequate solutions due to the continued existence of the beneficial use impairments. The benthic community is still degraded, and even as recently as 2007, they still had to conduct an emergency removal of some found contaminated soils. So it's important, though, to think about how 100 years of contamination took place, of a large volume and a diverse type of contamination. So this 40 years of remediation that has been done so far is probably not enough to restore it to its former status. So more effective remediation could be considered for the shoreline soils, but I would say that progress has been made, and it will be a long process, but it seems that things are improving, and at least there's more funding now. And yes. Okay, well, I'll take any questions at this time. Thank you for listening.